Welcome to Community Capital, a podcast about visionary founders and dedicated community builders who are shaping the future one connection at a time. I'm your host, Zara Naqvi, Head of Founder Community at Republic. Hi, Courtney. Thank you so much for joining us on Community Capital. We're so excited to have you. I think the first thing that I really just want to open up the conversation with is that you are incredibly accomplished. You're a founder, you're an LP, investor, advisor, and you've done so much in this ecosystem across various industries. And so I'm really curious, did you know what you wanted to do early on in your life, or if you wanted to be in VC?
Wow. Well, thank you, first of all. And I absolutely had no idea that I would end up where I am today. I, as a young girl, wanted to be a marine biologist. And as a college student, I wanted to be a English literature or philosophy professor. When I graduated, I wanted to be a writer. So, just kept following the path one step, in front of the other. And here we are today.
Yeah, and so speaking really specifically to Akua, the company that you're a founder of, I always love to understand what the one moment was or the series of moments that led to you knowing that you were going to found the company. What was that process like?
There was one moment. I remember it very clearly. I tend to remember most moments where I'm on the water very clearly. We were in a little boat and out on the Thimble Islands, which is just north of New Haven, Connecticut. And I pulled a rope out of that water, saw a little piece of kelp growing. It was kind of, midway through the growing season. And I ate the kelp right from the rope. And I just thought, this is so delicious. Imagine discovering a brand new, delicious food that's super healthy for you and sustainable. So that was my moment.
And so after you had that moment, I always love asking founders this because I feel that a lot of the narratives that we hear in our ecosystem are like, you had the idea and then the company was perfect and the product was there. And we very rarely hear about what the first few things you do are. So once you had that moment, you ate the kelp off the rope. What did it look like in terms of immediately founding the company? Did you go down like the legal route or the branding route or product? How did you really figure out what were those first steps going to look like?
It's a great question. And yeah, I think anyone, will tell you starting a business, it is bloody for years. It is so hard. And I think there are very few counterexamples to that. Success never happens overnight, maybe unless you're Instagram. But when I first took a bite of that kelp, I went, to the supplier, the farmer. I said, I'm going to need bags of this, like immediately. And I started with product. I think in order of things that I focused on really had to do with kind of what my core strengths were and are. I spent a lot of time on marketing and brand. In fact, probably too much time to just get started. I breezed over legal to the tune of many consequences. And I sort of delegated operations. So starting with product is always the most important thing. And I would say that that's good advice. But if I could do it all over again, I would have focused on operations next. How do you make this product at scale? 3, legal, because companies are really legal infrastructures and, accounting books at the end of the day. And then last was branding and marketing. But again, we do what we know. And, if I was doing it all over again, I would not make those mistakes, but they weren't mistakes because I didn't know.
Yeah, and I think I'm also just so curious about the fact that you have such a breadth of experience in the ecosystem. Again, like I mentioned in the beginning, as an advisor, as an investor, as an LP. All of those experiences collectively, how do you feel they kind of informed the journey that you've had as a founder, whether that's thinking about which companies you want to be an advisor of or which companies you want to invest in? How did that kind of inform the way that you approached, I guess, the fundraising process for Akua, or just approach the way that you wanted to structure the company?
Yeah, so it wasn't really until I started Akua that I started investing in other companies because I realized like the just how quickly value could be created with startups. I have a friend who started Away, and I didn't invest, and that was also a painful learning. And so I think, watching my friends throw 10K in and pull out $1 million a few years later was definitely one memory I won't forget. Anyway, I went into that, ecosystem really with tech and startups as a journalist and as someone who loved stories and loved product and loved people. And I think that's continued with my investment thesis and, the types of companies I get more involved with as an advisor. For me, I have to get super excited about whatever it is. I'm not, I think some founders or advisors are excited about businesses for business's sake. Like, sort of destroying the competitive landscape or owning a category or, the scalability of the thing. And for me, it's the thing itself. So yeah. And then obviously you want to work with people that, lift you up and energize you and inspire you. And that's a big piece of it too.
For sure. And so I think this goes so seamlessly into my next question, which is related to the capital part of community capital. You fundraised from an incredible amount of VCs that are also just incredible venture capitalists themselves. And so I'm really curious to kind of understand when you were starting that process. I always hear different narratives about some founders having a spreadsheet and then just like emailing 300 people. Some of them take like a different approach. What was your approach to fundraising and going through that process?
Well, there's something to be said about the numbers game and having a spreadsheet of 300 people. It is a combination between like, having that numbers game hit list and like an art to it of, kind of like dating, you don't want to seem desperate for a date on a Saturday night, but you also want to make sure you're available for the right people they're going to be a right fit for you and not, getting intros and cold reaching out to people who are never going to invest in your company. It's a waste of both people's time and it reflects poorly on the founder. So I think have a really strong network. It's always been one of my core strengths in life. And so it's a lot of asking friends for introductions, but it's also about looking at other companies that are in a similar space. And, when they announce their fundraisers, like who's investing and then doing research and then looking on LinkedIn for a warm intro. I think I've seen a lot of success with that tactic. Yeah. And we've raised almost $5 million to date for Akua, which has been, impressive and some would say, but so many of those checks were 25K checks from friends and fellow founders who believed in me as a person and believe in what we're doing as a mission. For the bigger checks, they didn't come until that very, very last round we did. And even then, most of those checks were still 10, 5, 15, 50, K. And there were a couple big ones which flushed it out.
Definitely. And so I think this also now lends itself to the community part of community capital, where it really sounds like you've had this incredible community for yourself and your network, but then also with Akua when it came to the fundraising journey. And so I always love to ask founders, we hear a lot about the community that you've built with your company, but I always love to understand, other than, I guess, the community and the network that you developed over time in the ecosystem, has there been a community of founders or like-minded individuals that have really supported you and kind of lended, I guess, guidance as part of your founder journey?
Yes. And the sort of mentorship, advice, and guidance doesn't always come from the people you expect it to. If you have that really successful friend who started a company where he or she could give you really great advice, sometimes it's just not the relationship. And, I think you have to be, I guess, looking for people who are not too far ahead of where you are. It's like I'm a new parent, and they always say, don't ask questions about babies that are like more than 6 months younger than your kid, because you've forgotten. Like as a parent of a 16-month-old, I really don't really remember what she was like as a 3-month-old. It's been such a blur. But for parents who have a 14-month-old, yes, I can give great advice. So I think similarly with a business landscape, you don't necessarily want to go after your heroes, people who have sold and IPO'd big companies when you're just starting a seed round. I think my best advice has come from more like peer mentorship, people who are just a few steps ahead that have, either made or avoided the mistakes that I'm going to, face in the next 6 to 12 months.
That's awesome advice, because I think sometimes people always want to reach out to, I guess, founders that are multiple steps ahead of them, but then having that conversation with someone who is like one step ahead of you or just maybe close their Series A as you're starting the process definitely makes more sense in terms of them being able to give you more specific advice. So, kind of pivoting to Akua now, I also love to ask founders, particularly in the consumer space, how you first approached getting your first customers, your first like people who are going to be super enthusiastic about your product. Because I think when you hear about Akua, it's such an innovative product. I was shocked at the idea, and then I tried it and I was like, this is amazing. And so I'm always just really curious about what that process looked like getting your first customers.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about low-hanging fruit and early adopters when we talk about Akua. I literally just today opened up an email from an investor who very politely and with about 4 paragraphs told me why he wasn't investing. And part of it was just like, he's like, I had to like convince myself to try this and people at my office. He's like, ick, kelp, because he's from Texas and he's like a, multi-generational probably meat eater. So, I think don't push a square peg into a round hole. I think when you're just getting started, like go after people who, like in the case of Akua, like live on Cape Cod or in the Hamptons or in San Francisco, places that are surrounded by water, places where people have been, more or less liberally educated and they understand climate change and they know what seaweed is and they know the health benefits of eating seaweed. Start there and then enable those early adopters and customers to be your evangelists and help you spread kelp burgers are delicious, word of mouth. Because to your point, like it is a bit of a strange concept, and then you try it and you're like, this is delicious. So that was our whole goal, right? Is like finding product market fit. How do we elevate kelp in the food, ecosystem? And by developing like the most delicious veggie burger with kelp at the center, is the way that we do that.
Mm-hmm. And so now that we've kind of established how you approached or thought about getting those first customers, I also like to address the fact that I think community has been a buzzword in our ecosystem since 2021. So many people are building community. And I think what I always find really interesting is how founders went from, okay, we have our customers or our users, and now we have a community. And I think Akua is such a good example because, like you mentioned, you have evangelists, you have people who are excited, spreading the word, sharing more about your product. And so I'd love to understand, how did you start to define community once you started to see those recurring customers coming through and people who are really excited about your company?
Yeah. So before I started Akua, was the global community director at Summit. And for 6 years, built one of the world's most premier entrepreneurial communities. So really like defined myself as a community builder, and, people would pay me to do that. Previous to that, I was head of, global development and audience is what they called it at a company called General Assembly, and launched them into Europe. And so much of the early success of that startup in Europe was about bringing in the right key stakeholders to support that business, which was in the tech ecosystem. And so when I, look at Akua and how we sort of thought, okay, these are community, not just customers, was really when we did our Kickstarter. We had just rebranded from Beyond the Shoreline. We used the Kickstarter as an opportunity to do that rebrand, announce kelp jerky as our first product. We raised about $75,000, and those 1,000 backers were really so much more than just, customers. That was the beauty of Kickstarter. And when, skip forward 2 years later, we did our Republic campaign. Again, it was just so much more emphasized. These were not just customers, these were investors. They were a part of the Akua community. Now, right before that, when the pandemic hit and we needed to do product development on the kelp burger, we launched what's called the Kelp Beta Burger Club. And we had 1,000 customers try the product, give us feedback. And I think that, again, like we wouldn't be able to do things like this if we didn't treat our customers like a community. Today we email them all the time. We need help getting into Whole Foods. Call this number, request us. We need help getting into Sprouts, like fill out this form. And they do it because they want to see us succeed, not only just because they're investors, but because they're a part of the Akua community.
That's awesome advice. I think, again, community is such an important part of building a brand, but then I feel like a lot of people struggle with defining it. And so hearing your perspective and how you really took that journey has definitely been super eye-opening. The last question that I love to end with, everyone does more than one word, but if you have one word to describe being a founder, what would that word be and why?
If I had one word to describe being a founder, it would be exploration. And everything that comes with that, peaks, valleys, being able to discover new parts of yourself that you didn't think were possible, relying on a team, going to places literally that no one's been to before, and near sudden death from, typhoid fever, like Oregon Trail style. I mean, it is tough being an entrepreneur. It is, when you're especially building something as new as what Akua is doing. So I would say exploration.
Thank you so much. You can find more of the Community Capital podcast here, wherever you're listening, and you'll be able to click on the links on this episode to find Courtney and more about Akua. Thanks so much for listening.